edition of the Big 12 Mafia Show on the College Football Mafia Network. I'm your host, Nathan Bomber Brown. And with me, as we go down this line of financials and NIL and college football funding and basketball, where all this money's coming from, we have another one of those players that's out there talking about this, especially with students and their parents. That would be Kristi Dosh. How you doing, Kristi?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I'm solo today, so I hope I can carry. You do all the heavy lifting, so
Yeah,
I'll
we'll be
just be
fine.
I'll just be driving a little bit. Welcome to the show. We appreciate you coming on. Last week we had Brian Mulvaney came on and helped us talk about some of the legal pictures and some of the things that's going on out in college sports in general. First of all, you want to introduce yourself? Tell everybody kind of who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I am also an attorney. Actually, Ryan is a good resource of mine when I need to bounce NIL ideas off of somebody. And he's featured prominently in my NIL book that's coming out this year because I needed somebody who had been actually looking at revenue sharing contracts. And I don't do that kind of work. So I tapped into him for that. But I was a practicing attorney until I was hired by ESPN to be their sports business reporter way back in 2011. And
Wow.
since then have been reporting particularly on the business and legal side of college sports ever since. I have another book that has been published previously called Saturday Millionaires that's about the business of college sports. And then I have a new one, the Athletes NIL Playbook, coming out this summer, largely based on all the reporting I've done on my website, businessofcollegesports.com, since NIL began. It has taken over my life. I teach NIL classes in undergrad and grad programs at University of Florida and do a lot of speaking and consulting on it at schools all over the country. So I eat, sleep, and breathe NIL.
What is the biggest challenge right now as you look at NIL and then you hear a lot of voices that are on the administrative side saying, this is going to ruin college sports. Other people are saying, no, giving the money to the players and their families, especially in a lot of cases where these are underprivileged students that go and play not professional sports, college sports. What is the biggest challenge that you see as we now work towards house being signed and go down the road towards revenue sharing?
Yeah, the challenges and the concerns have changed over time. I remember when this was going into effect in 2021 and for like the year leading up to it, the big concern from athletic departments was that sponsors were going to stop spending money with athletics because they were going to spend all their money with athletes.
Right.
That isn't what we've seen at all. Instead, what we've seen is sponsors who want to do branded campaigns with both. They're already an athletic department sponsor, and now they want to pull in athletes to work with to feature on their billboards or in their commercials or in their social media. And so I have yet to see any athletic department produce any sort of proof that this affected their sponsorship dollars at all. Well, then the next concern was that it was going to affect their donations, that
Right.
donors were going to be funding NIL deals instead of donating to the athletic department. And again, I haven't seen any real evidence that that's been the case. That being said, there are big shifts with that happening, particularly as we move into this summer with revenue sharing, but also with changing rules around the ability for athletic departments and universities to work directly with athletes and to
Right.
do NIL deals with them directly. And so you do see those foundations that used to focus on raising money to, build facilities or endow coaches or whatever project they had on the horizon. They are now shifting a lot of their efforts towards revenue sharing and NIL so that they can put together the best financial packages possible to attract recruits and transfers.
What was the biggest? I mean, because you bring up a good point. It's like this money sort of came out of nowhere. We all of a sudden we had one case that was settled essentially, and it opens up this sort of barn door way of looking at money reaching the athletes, whether it's college football or pro or basketball. And everybody thought it was skies falling, that we're not going to be able to manage this. It's all going to go crazy, and you're only going to have two teams like the Yankees and the Dodgers of college football. And that hasn't been the case at all. This last year, you could argue, might have been the most competitive college football program season in decades. So were those concerns sort of, chicken little skies falling, or do you really think that it's just taking a little bit of time for this thing to get started where people are now acclimated with it?
I think that NIL happening at the same time that the transfer rules changed and the transfer portal came into being created a new landscape in college football. And I have seen a lot of arguments from folks out there who concentrate a little bit more on the field performance than I do, talking about how they do think it's created greater parity and has given some teams the opportunity, to shape rosters and to be more competitive. I think a big part of that is the transfer portal, but
Right.
we're using NIL, and in the future we'll be using revenue sharing as a way to attract that talent that's inside the portal. That being said, it opens a new can of worms in a few different ways. Talking about the transfer portal, I think about the athletes and the parents who've reached out to me and told stories about getting induced to enter the portal by a
Yeah.
coach or a school, and then not getting picked up, or getting picked up but not getting the money that they were promised. And
Right.
starting to see those stories come out. We're starting to even see court cases around those stories. You had and this was a recruit, not a transfer, but you had Rashada with Florida, who is
Right.
because there was an actual written contract and he still didn't get the money that he was supposed to get. And you've got lots of other athletes who have text messages and phone calls and promises that aren't necessarily in contracts. We've got the Florida State basketball situation that came
Right.
here recently where promises were made. And I think you're going to see more and more of that. And it'll be interesting to see how that gets managed. And is it the NCAA or some other governing body that reins that in? Or is it going to play out in the courts like we're seeing so far? So I sort of see that as problem number one that is starting to arise. And problem number two with revenue sharing, which is probably a bigger discussion we can get into now or later, is the effect this is going to have on all the other sports, because
Right.
revenue sharing is largely going to go to football and men's basketball, and maybe in small amounts to women's basketball and a couple of other sports. But most sports are not going to see the advantage of it, and in fact may be disadvantaged because of it. They may have budgets cut. They may have the whole sport cut. They may have the
Yep.
sport move to club status. I do think you're going to see a major shift in what college athletic departments look like as a result of this move to revenue sharing. We've seen people, athletic departments laying off employees. There's a trickle down effect of essentially moving a large portion of revenue over to the athletes. And so I think you're going to see a lot of things change in college athletics.
Do you think there's gonna eventually end up with a disparity between privates, BYU is a private school versus these state-funded organizations that the money can basically come in and you don't even know where it's coming from, and how that affects the individual player? Because if a BYU commit comes in, a lot of that money you're not gonna. It's not publicly reported. There's no reason anybody needs to know where their money goes. You have state-funded organizations; they have reporting requirements. Is there going to be counter programming? In other words, are people going to recruit one against the other based on the restrictions or not restrictions, depending on the school?
I don't think we're going to see a big difference in the public versus private in that sense. With revenue sharing, everybody's going to be under the same cap, which in the first year is
Right.
$20.5 million. And I was having a conversation with a reporter earlier today about, what that is going to look like in terms of NIL money that's going to be stacked on top of that, because that doesn't count for the cap. And so
Right.
collectives and others can still do NIL deals with athletes separate from what they're earning from the university. So, I mean, you may see some athletes as much as doubling the income that they had, because they're going to expect the same NIL money they were already getting. Plus now they're going to get revenue sharing. Now, I don't think it's going to work out that way for everybody, but
Right.
you're going to see some really big numbers out there. And I think every school has that ability to tap into their alumni network and to go above that 20.5 million. There's going to be reporting requirements under the settlement to a clearinghouse of sorts for deals that are $600 or more. And if the deal is with a booster or a collective, it's going to be subject to this fair market value analysis, which is a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah, that
Because
hasn't even
nobody,
started, right?
nobody knows what
Right.
fair market value means. There's an
Yeah.
argument that fair market value is whatever somebody's willing to pay. That's obviously not the way they're going to define it, or they wouldn't say that they're going to be looking into fair market value. But, I
Right.
was thinking about this earlier today. And if we're talking about true market value and it not just being performance on the field, if we're talking about an NIL deal and it is really about an individual's value as a personal brand, I was thinking about Travis Hunter at Colorado today, and he's done quite a few deals with fishing and like outdoor sort of brand because he does a lot of fishing on his YouTube channel and on his other social platforms. So his value to say Bass Pro Shop or to a brand of, and I'm trying to think of, my dad's a big fisherman. I can't believe I'm like blanking on the name of a rod and reel, but he's gonna attract brands like that in a way that maybe a similar player on the field who only posts about football isn't going to have those kind of brand opportunities. Right. And so obviously like the big money we all know is tied to the fact that you are excelling on the field. And even though it's supposed to be true NIL, we know that a lot of it is really based on performance on the field. But if we're talking fair market value of NIL deals, like you can't just say that because two athletes are quarterbacks at similar institutions that their fair market value is the same, because that's simply not true because of a number of other factors about them, about their school, about their town, about, their hobbies outside of their sport. So I have no idea how they're going to do this. What I do know is there's a lot of attorneys who are very excited to bring cases fighting fair market value. So expect those.
Yeah, I think, and maybe that's turned people off a little bit about just it's been this reign of attorneys and suits and countersuits going either in proposal for House, or people are saying, no, we don't want any part of that. We're going to do our own thing. And I think there's a lot of people that say, I don't want more lawyers in my life, so it sucks that we're going to have more of this in sports. But let's talk about one of the news items that came out today. There's two, actually. Title IX was basically reeled back in, and I never even saw why it was put in there in the first place, because NIL deals aren't related to any of the work that's going on at the school and federal funding. But Title IX, and then this new idea of the CEO and a commission they're going to build for all the power conferences that's basically going to be the new NCAA. Where do you see this thing going with those two things as it relates to player compensation and NIL deals?
Yeah, so Title IX, when that came out, look, I'm female. I played sports growing up. I support Title IX. I don't think Title IX has anything to do with NIL. Revenue sharing, I think there are arguments to be made. I've talked to a number of NIL attorneys about this because the money comes directly from the schools. There is an argument to be made that Title IX should apply to it. I've seen attorneys, though, on the other side argue this isn't, education related financial aid. This is about market value and therefore shouldn't be subject to Title IX. That's going to have to get solved in the courts, I think. What we saw was that under the Biden administration, the Department of Education put out guidance saying Title IX does apply to revenue sharing, which would be a huge shift because most athletic departments have already been pretty public that their revenue sharing is going to be something like 75 to 80% to football, 10 to 15% to men's basketball, and the rest, who knows where, depending on the school. And so that would obviously change people's plans. I've heard athletic directors all along say the argument's going to be we're dividing revenue sharing proportionate to how the revenue comes in. And I've talked to Title IX attorneys who've said that's defensible, that you could go to court with that, and that's, sort of a formula that's been used in the past in terms of how money is spent on sports for marketing and promotion. Like you might spend more money on Facebook ads for football season tickets than you would, say, gymnastics season tickets, because football is going to bring in more money. So you're going to spend more money on the ads. So that same sort of logic has been applied to revenue sharing. And I've talked to Title IX attorneys on sort of both sides. I would say that even the ones who want Title IX to apply, I would say seem a little skeptical that they can argue that it does. But when it comes to the NIL money that's coming out of, collectives or brand deals, I don't think it applies there unless the athletic department is directing the collective where to put it. That gets into a gray area. But again, we're going to see cases about it. There's currently a case out in Oregon. The collective was not named as a defendant in the case, but Ducks of a Feather, which is the collective for Oregon, they were named in the complaint. So they're not a party to the lawsuit, but their sort of disparate treatment of male versus female athletes at Oregon is mentioned in the suit. I believe it's been about a year since that suit was filed. So that is ongoing. There haven't been it hasn't gone to trial. We haven't seen anything come out of that yet, but that might give us a good idea of where judges are headed on this. So I would expect to see Title IX litigation coming as revenue sharing gets up and going.
I mean, that makes sense. So I'm going to take a second here. If you're watching right now, we're not going to do a general Q&A tonight, but if you do have a super chat you want to get out, you go ahead and put that in there, and I'll try to get that to Kristi before she takes off this evening. Right before we came on the air, you started to talk about something you were worried about. Have you already covered that already?
No, well, sort of. So I turned in my NIL book to my editors about a month ago,
Okay.
and I can make changes up to, I think the date's March 3rd. However, the House settlement doesn't have their final hearing until April 7th, and it could
Right.
take the judge a couple of weeks after that to rule. It seemed like when I was writing the book, we all sort of agreed it was going to happen. However, about 3 hours after I turned it in, the Department of Justice sent a letter about the case that put a little more scrutiny on the case and made me, along with some other attorneys in the space, worried that maybe the settlement won't ultimately be approved. Now, I think that sentiment has shifted. That was all the week before inauguration. So now we've
Right.
got a new administration in, and we're still seeing how things are going to settle out as far as college football related topics go. And so my concern has always been how I can talk about revenue sharing in this book, which is really meant for athletes and their parents to know how to get started with NIL and know how to do NIL deals in a way that is financially advantageous, but is also protects the athlete and protects their assets and their intellectual property. And I wanted to have this chapter at the end about revenue sharing, and in particular about clauses to look out for in revenue sharing contracts. And that's where Ryan, who you had on the show last week, was such a huge help to me in writing that chapter, because he had seen a lot of the revenue sharing contracts and was able to share with me some clauses I hadn't seen. And I was able to write about that for parents. However, if the House settlement didn't get approved, my discussion with my editor was, well, what happens to that chapter? It will have already gone to print. So we need to think in advance about how to set that up. I firmly believe that even if the House settlement isn't ultimately approved, revenue sharing is still coming. I mean,
Yes.
athletic departments were already giving out the contracts, since December.
Yeah.
Some of those contracts only go through July 1st. And then the idea was, as of July 1st, when revenue sharing would start, new contracts would take their place. So, and schools have hedged their bets. Some of the contracts say they're only valid if House is approved. But I feel like, what is that saying? The horse is out of the barn. Like, revenue sharing is going to happen, I think, whether the House settlement is ultimately approved or not. I still think we'll see revenue sharing next year. So I'm going to put that caveat and say, as of going to print, here's what we know about revenue sharing. But my way to sort of future proof the book, because the rest of the book I'm not worried about. The rest of the book with
Right.
how-tos on pricing yourself, hiring an agent, all these different things need to know how to do to take advantage of NIL. None of that's changing. It's really just this little bit at the final chapter where I talk about the future. And I'm just going to let people know that the website for the book will stay updated, and that folks can get the latest information on revenue sharing and high school association rules and all these other things that might change that I didn't want to put in print, I will keep those things updated on the website. And I think that's the best I can do now, because I've wanted to write this book for 4 years and things just kept changing and I couldn't get it out. And I don't think it's ever going to settle into a space where it's not changing. So it's just time to get it out there, and then people can refer to the website for updates.
Why isn't there a simple requirement that students get legal protection? In other words, they get legal advice before they can sign any contract. Hell, just hand them your book, for heaven's sakes.
Yeah.
I've been really surprised that the NIL deals that we have spoken about, certainly Wisconsin versus the receiver that went to Miami. Why didn't he simply get legal? He could have had advice that would have helped him maybe steer around some of those clauses in there that they think they've got him, and Miami doesn't want to let him go. And
Yeah.
I don't understand why it's not a requirement. Is that possible to do?
Yeah, I don't know that they would ever make it a requirement. It's advised, especially when if you made it a requirement, it would have to be for deals maybe over a certain amount of money, because you've got
Okay.
athletes who are out there doing brand deals for $50, $100. It's
Yeah.
more expensive in those cases to hire an attorney to look at it than what they're making from the deal. And so I spend a whole chapter in the book talking about contracts and clauses to watch out for and what certain words mean, so you don't get yourself into a deal that you regret later. But I also keep up an index on my website of attorneys who do speak with athletes about NIL, and many of them have free consultations. Many law schools on campuses provide clinics where athletes could go have their contracts looked at for free. So there are resources out there. And I think increasingly we're going to see athletic departments offer more of those resources. A lot of NIL directors are attorneys and are already giving advice to athletes. I don't see them mandating that athletes have to be represented by somebody. But it's available for the athletes who want to take advantage of that. I always tell athletes, contact me and I will get you to somebody, because there are people out there who can help you. The problem is the athletes, this is what I see happen, because I run a Facebook group full of parents. And what I see happen is the athlete signs the contract, then they tell their parents about it. And sometimes the parent knows enough that when they read the contract, they see things that are problematic. They'll send them to me and they'll have it highlighted and say, does this say, I think this says this. Does it? And I'll be like, yeah, unfortunately it does. And their kids already signed it. They're just so excited to get a deal. Some of these dollar amounts are huge. Like the last one I looked at that a parent sent me like that, it was a $40,000 contract and the athlete just signed away. He was so excited. Parents had no idea he had signed it. At least with high school kids, if you're under 18, the parents got to sign it for you. But with the college kids that are over 18, a lot of them are just signing it without talking to anybody about it. And then the problems are coming up later, which is really unfortunate. So, I think education in this space is key. Athletic departments have all sorts of educational resources available, platforms and apps and recorded video and people who come in like me and speak to athletes. But I do contract sessions with them and you can see their eyes when they just glaze over. Nobody wants to talk about contracts until it's a problem. Then they want to talk about it.
Absolutely. And I can see how we got here too, how that would be something, the natural progression that we would find ourselves. We're sort of midstream as NIL matures. So do the contracts and some of those relationships as they're built. Earl Carr gifted 5 Big 12 Mafia memberships. Appreciate that, Earl. At the end of the show, I will go in and I will call out who those went to, because I don't have my little client open. But I appreciate the memberships. Thank you very much, Earl. And if you've received those memberships, first of all, make sure you thank Earl for doing that. And secondly, check us out. Go to the main page on YouTube and watch some of those historic videos we've got on there. Realignment's kicking back up, and that's what they're there for. Okay. Predatory NIL deals. These deals that these students, like you said, they're excited. They just want whatever they're going to get given to them for just playing a game they were already going to do. Where do we go from here? Because up to now, there's been a huge disparity in on NIL deals. Some have been high quality. You could take them to anybody, and they're straight up and down. And then there's others that we hear that are just taking advantage of the players left and right. Is this just a natural progression, or are there additional rules that are going to need to be put in to sort of prevent some of those predatory contracts from being out there?
The contracts are getting better. So when I looked at some of the collective contracts as collectives were first coming on the scene and doing their initial deals, and look, I consulted with collectives. I have no problem with collectives. I think there are some out there that are doing a wonderful job, but I also saw some collective contracts that were really concerning in the beginning that took rights in perpetuity. So for example, if you were, a college football player and you signed this deal, maybe you signed a deal for $20,000, $40,000 with a collective for this season, but buried in there in the legalese was that they could use your name, image, and likeness in perpetuity. So if you go on and you become a huge star in the NFL, they can still be selling, merchandise and all sorts of stuff with your name, image, and likeness on it at the collegiate level. And it might not be worth that 20 or 40,000 you got. Your NIL value is going to have increased years later when you're in the NFL and you're a big star. Right. And so I saw those clauses as problematic, and I found that most athletes didn't understand that that's what it meant. Perpetuity is one of those terms I'm constantly talking to them about, and I just tell them, do a control F on the document. And I give them a few words. I'm like, look for these words and just highlight them. Those are problematic words. And you need to go see somebody if those words are in your contract. And perpetuity is one of those. It's not always a hard no. It depends on what it applies to, but you better know what it applies to, because that means forever. And you need to know what you're giving up and whether the value you're getting for what you're giving up is appropriate or not. So that was a big one we saw early on. We also saw collectives that were taking huge percentages of the deals that they brokered with
Right.
brands that really, quite frankly, were not appropriate percentages to be taking. We saw ones where they were taking rights to create merchandise for the student athlete without the student athlete being involved. Or one of the ones I reviewed, the athlete didn't have the ability to really create any of his own. He had created a logo with a friend of his, and they were going to put these t-shirts up on a website. The friend was a graphic designer and had built out this website. And then come to find out, his collective contract said that any logo he created while he was in his term with them, they had the sole right to market and promote. So he actually couldn't create his own t-shirts and run his own website. So there were things like that in the beginning in particular. I've seen a lot of that fall off. I think
Okay.
what's happened is collectives have gotten more savvy. You know, some of them have hired better attorneys to draft their contracts, but also they're now competing for this talent with a lot of other collectives. And
Right.
so if you're asking for a huge percentage or you're putting some of these predatory terms in there, athletes and parents are getting more savvy about it. And other collectives and other schools are getting more savvy about it. And they're saying, hey, we know that school always puts this in their contract. This is what it means. And we don't do that. And so I think contracts have had to become more competitive. And now I see them looking very similar. Whereas I'd say in the first year to 18 months, they looked wildly different. But
Right.
now there's a collective association. These folks all talk to each other. And we've seen it. It's not standard. I wouldn't say the contracts all look identical, but we've seen some of that predatory stuff fall away and just some of the predatory businesses and collectives fall away because they weren't they weren't well financed, they weren't well organized, they were, sort of preying on student athletes and got found out and aren't part of the marketplace anymore. So I actually do think it's gotten safer and more athlete friendly as time has gone on.
What are the top one or two questions that you hear from most parents and students?
I mean, the number one is just how do we get started in my parent
Yeah.
group? As soon as somebody joins the group, like the first post they put up in the Facebook group is how do we get started? So I have a how to get started guide.
Right. That's good.
College sports. And it's like, here's the link. Like read this and then come back to me if you have questions I didn't answer there. And hardly
Okay.
anybody comes back because I think it's pretty comprehensive. And then the book will be the book sort of is a very expanded version of this blog post that I've always had about how to get started. So that's really the main one. And then, beyond that, it's a lot of questions around revenue sharing and what it is, who it's going to apply to, what it means for the future of other sports. And, what a lot of non-football athletes and their parents kind of, got out of the house settlement and clung onto was the increase in scholarships for a lot
Right.
of sports and the ability to give a full scholarship to everybody on the roster. And unfortunately, a lot of parents in the group came in and were like, oh, that means my daughter's going to get a full scholarship now because now everybody on the team can have a full
No,
scholarship. And it's like, no, that's not what it means. I
that's
mean,
not what it means at
yeah,
all.
it's not going
Yeah. I mean, it's wishful thinking, right? It's a good thing,
to.
but
So everybody is still trying to figure, I find particularly parents of high school students, they're new to this. And some of us have been in this world now for like 4 years and we've seen all the things that happen. And it's interesting. I'll see parents of college athletes or even parents who their college athletes have now graduated who are still in my group and hanging around and giving advice. And they're like the seasoned veterans that know how things work. And then you get these high school parents who this is all brand new to them. They have no idea how it works. Nobody they know is doing an NIL deal. So there's a real kind of disparity in education, I would say, at the high school level. And then all of a sudden they're getting offers from collectives and from schools for NIL and now for revenue sharing. And it's just so new to everybody. And there's frankly not a lot of resources out there, which is something I've been trying to solve.
how quickly are we going to get up on plane where it's just humming along like the little engine that could? You won't have these big up and down reports in the news of players falling out with their collectives or not getting paid what they need. Are we still are we early in this process, or are we
I
coming
think a
up on
decade.
a decade?
Yeah. I think you
Okay.
got to wait that some of these, like the Rashada case, I mean, that was filed. I mean, I'd have to look back. That's got to be a year and a half, 2 years ago. It's got
I
to be
think it's about
2
2
years
years
now.
ago, yeah.
2 years, and like it's barely progressed at all. So for
Right.
some of these cases to work themselves out and for us to sort of figure out, okay, where are we drawing the line, like, and what are the protections that are in place, with revenue sharing coming, it's going to take years for that to settle out. Now, you mentioned earlier the story that was in the news today about this potential CEO sort of over the Power Forward.
Right.
That's an LLC that sort of came about in the news last week that would be the Power Four, and they would potentially be handling the enforcement
Right.
around the House settlement. But like, I was doing another interview earlier today, and they said, well, what about the group of 5 schools who opt into the House settlement? Is it the NCAA enforcing against them, or is it this Power Four LLC, or are they only policing the Power Four? I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. So I do think we're still really early days for everything settling out, including that NIL is making this big shift because now schools can work more directly, even when they're not paying athletes directly. They can actually serve as the marketing agency for athletes. They can openly broker deals for them, which is something BYU did from the very beginning. They had
Right.
that Built
Been very
Protein deal at
progressive.
the very beginning, but a
Yeah.
lot of schools had not been doing that. They didn't think they could do it under NCAA rules, or they were operating under state laws that didn't allow institutional involvement, as it was
Right.
called. That's all shifting. So not only do we have revenue sharing that's brand new, but now we have NIL rules shifting. And then we have to see how these court cases play out for the things that aren't working. And I think there's more court cases that will come as a result of the House settlement, both around the cap that it sets and around the Title IX implications, and potentially around implications of cutting sports and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I mean, a decade? We started having these NIL conversations around the Ed O'Bannon trial in like 09, 10, and
Okay.
still seeing the dominoes fall that started there. And, it's how many years later? So I think it's going to be a while.
What's the biggest detractor? The fact that we don't have anything from Congress. There's no, we have Ted Cruz out there saying he's wishing that there was a czar, and we
Yeah.
had all this control over college sports, and we're going to institute changes so they get protections. And then on the other side, you have lawyers that are saying nobody's helping my guy, so I got to do what I can for
Yeah.
them. It,
I mean, nothing
somehow
has
they
made
need to
it.
meet, right?
Yeah, nothing has made it out of committee. All these NIL laws that have been proposed at the federal level over the last 4 or 5 years, nothing's ever made it out of committee.
Right.
And
Right.
so I have never had any faith that anything's happening at the federal level. They don't all agree on what should even be in it. A lot of the proposals not only had NIL, but they had health and safety regulations and, other sort of unrelated things. And not that that's bad, but there's never been a consensus on what this should look like. And then
Right.
you've got the Title IX issues. There are some serious issues with international athletes that are only going to get worse with revenue sharing. And so, yes, it would take a federal law to solve the big picture problems, but no, I don't think one is coming.
Okay. Yeah. When the House settlement was when was that, last April or March when that was
Mhm.
announced? The very first thing that came to my mind was I don't think this thing will ever be fully implemented because they cut out 2/3 of all college football from the settlement itself, and basically they're saying, especially the small schools, you have to pay into this, even though your players aren't the ones getting the greatest benefit.
Yeah,
So
for the
when you
back
brought that
pay.
up earlier, yeah, so I'm like wondering, how does this get? Something has to change. I don't know what it's going to be, but either it needs to be given an overall umbrella by Congress saying, okay, these are the things where you guys can do, paint within the lines, or we'll continue to live in this world where we're legislating through judicial fiat. And I don't think either one of those things is good.
No, and I think the only other solution that people bring up is making them employees, or finally recognizing that they're employees. People
Right.
who believe they are will say you don't make them employees, like they are by law already.
Yeah.
And then collectively bargaining so that you can have a cap and there's no antitrust issue, and so that you do have uniform rules. You would even have a uniform contract. It would solve a lot of problems. It would also create some new problems, particularly with the way that college athletics in general financially survives. Football and men's basketball provide the money for basically all of the other sports. I used to do this study every year. I started reporting on college sports, I think in 09, maybe even 08. And I would do these studies every year, and I would look at which sports make money. And football and men's basketball were like your only hope. Every once in a while, some other program would manage to break even. And I know like Nebraska women's volleyball, a couple of years, they made money. There was a baseball team here and there. I think one year I saw a men's hockey team, but it's largely they all operate at a loss. In addition to all the championships operate at a loss. I used to do this story every year, and I teach it in my college sports reporting class, so I know it's still pretty accurate. Only 5 sports, only 5 championships make money for the NCAA. All the rest of them lose money across all 3 divisions. We're talking dozens and dozens and dozens of championship events that all are financial losers. It's the men's basketball tournament that pays for all of that. College football obviously is in its own sort of ecosystem with the college football playoff. But if we're talking about making football and potentially men's basketball athletes employees, I think there's questions too about at which schools. Like, is it only at the Power 4? Is it all of Division 1? There's obviously some football programs in Division 1 that look really different from Power 5 programs. So, even employment, I think, creates new problems and doesn't solve everything. It perhaps solves issues around a salary cap and having uniform rules and that sort of thing, but it creates new problems.
I think it's so amazing that we've gotten here and we still have so far to go. 10-year horizon, we'll keep working on that. Kristi Dosh, why don't you tell everybody where to find your stuff and kind of tell them about this book, because I think it's pretty exciting. My son played college lacrosse, and it's not like they were throwing money at a college lacrosse player in the middle of Wisconsin. But I think that would have been something, that education, that I probably would have bought the book and just tried to get educated on that. Tell everybody kind of what you got going there.
Yeah, so I've been writing about NIL since about a year before it even went into effect, and have literally followed it day by day since then, and have had the opportunity to work with college athletes across all 3 divisions, and to work with coaches and administrators as they've figured out this space as well. I do a lot of speaking and consulting, and then teach NIL classes at Florida. So I've developed this book over the last 4 years, and it's called The Athletes NIL Playbook, and it has its own website, The Athletes NIL Playbook.com. It's on pre-order right now and comes out July 2nd, but I've got all sorts of fun pre-order bonuses if you pre-order it, where you get more access to me to ask me questions. You can have me look at pitches that you want to send to a brand or your kid wants to send to a brand. There's pitch templates in there. There's pricing formulas so you can make sure you're getting all the money you should be getting. We talked about advice for contracts, both NIL contracts and revenue sharing contracts. And I have all these little kind of mini case studies of real athletes, and they're relatable athletes. They're not the big household name athletes who are getting $5 million deals or have 2 million followers on social media. I tried to get a good cross section of athletes from Division 1, 2, and 3 and NAIA, and across a huge swath of different sports, to show you that NIL is for everybody. And it's not just social media. There's all these other NIL opportunities, teaching lessons and running camps and clinics, getting paid for your music. A bunch of athletes have written books now. You don't even hear about it, but a lot of them are doing really well with that. So I talked about all the different ways you can make NIL money with NIL, and ways to use it to set yourself up well for a career after graduation. Because, we always hear the NCAA say how many athletes don't go pro in their sport and have to go pro in something else. And I've seen NIL do incredible things for athletes over the last few years and legitimately change their future and their career path. And we talked about the rest of NIL, like football and men's basketball is like this kind of NIL over here, and everybody else is over here. And the book is more about everybody else over here, because the big name folks, they've got agents who are out there doing all this for them. This is for folks who don't have an agent, who need to figure out how to navigate it on their own.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. We'll have to have you on more as we get closer to
Please
your
do.
book release. We definitely want to promote that as much as we can. So, if there's anything we can do here to help get the word out, we certainly will do it on our own. But I really appreciate you joining me tonight.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Everybody have a great night. We are together again on Friday for the Big Freaking Friday show. Other than that, everybody stay out of trouble. Have a great evening. And thank you very much, Kristi. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye bye. Peace out.